Claire, and for being brief. That was a good feat to get through all those points quickly. Nick Hall, Head of Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation at Save the Children.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks very much for everybody. I think I'll try and be even briefer because I'm looking forward to a discussion. Children are indeed vulnerable, or at least some children are vulnerable, but many of them are not, of course, and children, of course, come in all ages, from 0 to 18, or just under 18, in fact, because you're a child until you're 18, even if you don't like to be called that. I've been working on children and disasters, and actually together with Tom and a few other people in the room as well, for some years now, together with a few other agencies like UNICEF and Plan and World Vision and Child Fund, and one of the documents is showing on the screen there that we produced some years ago about children and disaster risk reduction. Mostly this has been focused around advocacy in the global platforms for DRR, and this is significant because we've got to a point now with HFA2 coming down the pipe, where children are in fact recognised as distinctly vulnerable, some children at least, and also that children are an active participant in disaster risk reduction. And it's pretty obvious, really, is if you get children educated about risk, and if you get them safe in their schools, in their homes, in their communities, etc., then you can build a culture of safety which passes through from one generation to the next, and clearly we're all going to be old people eventually, elderly. I'm not quite sure what the right word is there. Elderly, I think. Older people. Well, I'm certainly getting there with that way myself. So if you build a culture of safety as children, then you're certainly going to have a safer society in future. As I said, we're broadly comfortable with the rhetoric in the zero draft, because children are mentioned, specifically identified, and they're recognised as major players. And some of the things that you need to do in order to ensure that you build this culture of safety are also reflected, and I could point to paragraphs in the document where that's the case. But I still think that there are gaps in the HFA2 zero draft at the moment, and I'm going to whiz through these. Oops, that's the wrong one to have pressed, wasn't it? Let's go back that way. That's the right one. This was, we produced, this is about 4 years ago, we produced a children's charter for disaster risk reduction. And one of the things children said, apart from their education must be safe, they also, children, these were children all over the world, said that disaster risk reduction activity must reach the most vulnerable people, all vulnerable people, whether they be older, younger, disabled in some way or another, girls, boys, all sorts, whatever their state of vulnerability. And this is one of the interesting things about children. If you ask them to identify who is most at risk in a locality, they will tell you. They pretty well know, and I guess you can remember yourself as children that you will remember you know which children get school meals, for example, in England, which children lack love at home, which children have got particular problems in one or another, or which people. So children are extremely valuable informants in a risk reduction planning process. In Save the Children, where I'm working now, we've been working on the post-2015 agendas, both the SDGs and the MDGs, the HFA2, the Financing for Development Agreement that's coming up soon as well. And we've been doing a lot of work on this. And in the post-2015 SDG proposed deal, we've seen, or we're proposing indeed, and we're seeing quite clearly now that the situation of children is quite clearly recognised across many of the proposed goals. And I think this is a rather important thing, because I think one of the key things about the HFA2 is the coherence, or the complementarity, the synergy with the other major global agreements. And that's what we want to see very clearly stated. And in fact, my presentation here is more about the SDGs than it is about the HFA2, because I think at the moment the SDG process has got much more clarity about children and about vulnerability reduction, arguably, than the HFA2 has, which is a bit sad in a sense. We've got a range of targets in the MDG SDG process, which talk about reducing disaster risk already. Goal 1, this is recommendations we're making: implement universal social protection schemes, and Claire mentioned social protection and social pensions as well. And these needed to be adapted, of course, to be disaster sensitive, let's say, or risk sensitive. That's goal 1. In the what we call goal 5, about protection from violence and protection generally of children, again, there's a target there that focuses on the situation in disasters. And again, on the participation one, and this will be music to Maureen's ears, I think, the gender target, especially for women and girls, although I agree that gender doesn't necessarily mean women and girls, it means men and boys as well. But equal participation, and this is the same as one sees in the Convention on Children's Rights. There's a participation article in the Convention. And so, and we've also got a target on disasters specifically as well. So my feeling is quite strongly at the moment is that the MDG SDG process seems to be more enabling of a sort of creating a culture of resilience, resistance, and safety in the future than what we're seeing at the moment in the HFA, which I think is a bit sad. Within the HFA2, there is a target, I think it's under targets 22 and 27 and 28 about education. And we've been very specific in our recommendations for the HFA2 about the education targets. And they're mentioned at various points in the document, but there needs to be specific indicators as well. And I've listed several of them there. You might, if you've got very good eyes, notice there's the word CAY, children and young people. And I'd just like very quickly to make a reference to that, because I think that one of the problems with the HFA2 is that we're forced into the major groups, so-called major stakeholder groups, whether it be private sector, children and youth, etc., farmers, all sorts. They're very catch-all phrases, these major groups, catch-all groups, and children and youth definitely is a catch-all, and it's an unfortunate conflation, I think, because a 1-year-old is very different from a 24-year-old who may well have a master's degree from Harvard, or somewhere else for that matter. But the HFA2 talks about children and youth as though they are one very, very similar group. They are not at all. Just as children aren't similar themselves as well. And so I'm just going to rush on quickly to the final points I wanted to make. The issue is governance and coherence, and there's a whole lot of acronyms there, apart from the Biodiversity Convention. Education for Sustainable Development is at the bottom then. The CRC is the Convention on Children's Rights. The point here is that governments are expected to report on pretty well all of these things. And it's an impossible burden on them. And if they do attempt to do it all, they tend to do a rather cursory job on a lot of them. And if we could somehow help governments to make their reporting load simpler by bringing together all of these different agreements, that would be a tremendous benefit, I think, to the governments. And it would also be a tremendous benefit actually to us in NGOs and agencies that are trying to push for these. The other one is about disaggregated data and targets as well. There's a need for these complementary targets and complementary same data sources as well. And a lot of governments don't collect the right sort of data, or the data that seems to be required in global agreements. There's a new data, a new risk management database in modelling system which is just being produced, just being introduced really. And they're using only 2 indices, which they choose those 2 indices of child underweight children, it's the sort of upper arm measurements of children, and child mortality, being as two indicators that most governments tend to collect. If you chose a whole bundle of other indicators, you'd never get the data, so it'd be pointless. And so I think that this is a key point.